It happened in less than a minute, but it changed everything. Steve Harvey, a man known for his commanding presence and sharp wit, suddenly went silent. Tears filled his eyes. The audience, normally filled with laughter, froze in stunned silence. They weren't watching a talk show anymore. They were witnessing something much deeper. A man confronting a moment he didn't expect, and it all started with a message from someone he'd never thought would speak so personally to him, Jason Statham. This wasn't a scripted moment. It wasn't entertainment. This was a man gritty, private, and notoriously tight-lipped stepping into the light to speak words that carried years of weight and perhaps even regret. Jason's message wasn't long, but it was real, raw. And for a man like Steve, who spent his life wearing a suit of strength and humor, those words broke through everything. You've seen viral clips, you've seen tears on TV, but this wasn't just emotion. It was history. It was connection. It was a story about two men, worlds apart, brought together by something few ever talk about: respect born through pain. What could Jason possibly say to bring Steve to tears? And what story connects them that's never been told until now? Stick with us, because by the end of this video, you'll understand why this moment mattered, not just for them, but for anyone who's ever held their pain in silence. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. This is one moment you're going to remember. Steve Harvey's journey from poverty in Cleveland to the heights of American television is nothing short of remarkable. Homeless for years, living out of his car while trying to break into stand-up, he knows the grind. He's built everything from the ground up: his name, his career, his brand. Through it all, he's worn a persona crafted out of confidence, comedy, and control. Jason Statham's rise looks different on paper. British-born, former diver, street-smart, and steely-eyed. Shaped by the grit of Bacali deals and underground fights. But beneath the surface, there's more. Like Steve, Jason fought his way into the spotlight, never handed a thing. And though their worlds rarely collided publicly, something about their stories rhymed to men from hard beginnings, both guarding their vulnerability with grit. They met years ago, not on a film set, not at an award show, but behind closed doors, away from cameras, during a private charity event. Steve had been invited to speak. Jason had come to quietly support a cause he never talked about publicly, one tied to his younger brother, now estranged. They shook hands. That was all. No photo, no press. Just a moment. But something passed between them, an unspoken recognition of shared scars. What neither man expected was that. Years later, their brief encounter would come full circle in a studio full of strangers. On live television during what should have been just another day on set, but Jason had carried something with him all that time. He had a message, one that would never be spoken on Instagram, never tweeted, never rehearsed. A message that would break through the armor of one of TV's toughest hosts and reveal the truth behind their unexpected bond. It began with a segment on fatherhood. Steve Harvey had been interviewing a group of young men from a mentorship program he sponsors, asking them what they believed it meant to be a man. The answers were heartfelt, honest. One young man said, "A man protects, even when no one sees it." Another said, "A man keeps going, even when he wants to quit." Steve nodded, visibly moved. His own history with fatherhood was complex. He'd made mistakes, missed time, struggled to balance fame and family, but he always came back to this: the responsibility to rise above. Behind the scenes, producers had been planning a surprise. They knew Steve wouldn't expect it. It played a short video. The screen lit up, and there he was, Jason Statham. Not in character, not promoting a film, but sitting quietly in a bare room, eyes steady, voice low. "Steve," he began, "I never forgot that night. I never told anyone what you said, but I've carried it. With me, there was no build-up, no dramatic music, just a man speaking from his gut. You told me. You don't get to choose who you save. You just save them. That stuck with me. I'd just had a falling out with my brother. You didn't know that. But your words, they mattered." The studio was silent. Steve leaned forward in his chair, lips pressed tight. Cameras caught at a flicker of memory, a flash of recognition. And in that moment, the wall began to crack. Jason continued, voice firmer now. I came here tonight, not as an actor, but as a man who wants to say thank you for what you gave me when you didn't even know you were giving it. The moment Jason's message ended, the room hung in silence. No applause, no movement, just stillness. Steve bowed his head, one hand gripping the edge of his chair. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than anyone had ever heard on his stage. I remember that night, he said. I wasn't supposed to be there long. My driver was waiting outside, but something told me to stay. He looked up, eyes glassy. And you looked like a man carrying something too heavy for one man to hold. No one had ever heard this story. Steve recounted how, after the event, Jason had lingered at the edge of the room, avoiding the crowd. Steve approached him not as a celebrity, but as someone who recognized a familiar loneliness. I told you about my own mistakes, Steve said. My boys, the time I lost. The silence between me and my father that never got fixed. The audience was locked in now. This wasn't just a story anymore. This was confession. Steve swallowed hard. I told you that night it ain't about being right, it's about being there, and then I left. I never thought you remembered. The weight of regret, the years lost between brothers. The silence between father and son, it was all pouring out. It's not just between Steve and Jason, but echoing through every heart watching. And somewhere, across the ocean, Jason had recorded that message with trembling hands, because he'd held on to those words for a reason. He'd used them, tried to live by them. And now, maybe, just maybe, he was ready to reach out to his brother again. Steve leaned back in his chair, rubbing his hands slowly together as though trying to warm up something deep inside, some old part of him that hadn't moved in years. His voice, still composed but trembling, said what few men of his stature ever admit on camera. You never know who's listening when you speak from the truth. He paused. And truth is heavy, sharp, cuts through you if you're not careful. What followed wasn't showmanship. It wasn't performance. It was memory, reaching up from the quiet parts of Steve's life, the moments off camera, when his kids wouldn't return his calls, when he sat alone in hotel rooms wondering if fame had cost him the one thing that mattered most. Jason's message had reopened that door, Steve continued. I spent so much time trying to build a name, a legacy, a brand. I forgot the sound of my oldest boy's laugh. That's what I think about now, not the Emmys, not the ratings. He looked straight into the camera. Jason, wherever you are, you brought me back to something I've been too scared to face. The crowd was hushed. No one dared interrupt the intimacy now unfolding. Even the stage crew stood frozen. Steve's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in focus. Maybe it's not too late, he said. Maybe that one moment we shared, maybe it was more than just coincidence. Maybe it was God putting two broken men in the same room with a chance to remind each other of what we'd both forgotten. A slow breath, a long silence. Then, finally, if you're watching, Jason, you're not the only one who needed to hear those words again. The studio audience, still wrapped in silence, finally exhaled as Steve smiled barely, but it was real. Something had shifted. The wound was still there, but now it had air. And with air comes healing. I'm good, he said softly, wiping beneath his eye, then letting out a single dry laugh. Y'all ain't gone, have me sobbing. On daytime TV, not twice. Laughter rippled through the room, not loud, but welcome. It was the sound of release, of shared breath. The emotional tension had reached its peak, and now it began to settle, just slightly. One of the producers stepped in with a card for the next segment, but Steve waved it away. He said, we're not doing that part today. Instead, Steve turned to the audience, not just those in front of him, but the millions watching across the country. If there's somebody in your life you need to talk to, don't wait for a television moment. Don't wait for applause. Pick up the phone. Go knock on a door. Say what needs saying. His voice was stronger now, steadier, still emotional, but no longer fragile. Jason reminded me that words last longer than silence. And sometimes the right words at the right time, they don't just change a person, they save him. The audience stood. It wasn't a typical standing ovation. It wasn't about the show. It was about the truth. They had just witnessed truth. That mirrored their own regrets, their own missed chances. And for the first time in a long while, Steve looked lighter. Like something he'd been carrying for decades had finally been set down. But healing is never linear. Later that evening, after the cameras stopped rolling and the applause had faded, Steve sat alone in his dressing room, staring at a photo. Of his sons, silence now felt different, less like solitude, more like unfinished business. He picked up his phone, thumb hovering over a number he hadn't called in too long. His eldest son, Brandon, their last conversation, had ended cold words exchanged in anger, pride overriding apology. Steve had told himself time would fix it. But time, as he was now realizing, only builds walls if you don't do the work to tear them down. He didn't call. Not yet. Instead, he drafted a message, erased it, drafted again. Still not right. And somewhere, in a flat in East London, Jason Statham stood facing his own dilemma. The message he'd recorded had taken weeks of courage. But he hadn't yet followed through with his brother. He hadn't picked up the phone, hadn't written the letter. The words from Steve that night replayed in his mind. Say what needs saying. He poured a drink, stared out the window. Rain slid down the glass like falling time. He hadn't cried not in years, but his chest was heavy, and it wasn't because of regret. It was because for the first time, he didn't feel alone in that weight. On different sides of the world, two men stood at a crossroads, both shaped by silence, both shaken by truth, and now each had a choice to make. Say the words, or live another year behind them. Morning came with clarity, not comfort. Steve Harvey sat at the kitchen table, coffee untouched, phone in hand. The night had been long full of memories, not sleep. He'd watched Jason's message a dozen more times, each viewing peeling back another layer of denial. He tapped out a message to Brandon. Can we talk? Then deleted it. Too easy, too vague, too late. He started again. I'm sorry. I wasn't what you needed when you needed me. That's on me. But if you're willing, I'd like to fix what's still fixable. His thumb hovered, then tapped. Send no reply. Not yet. But the message was out there now. And with it, a piece of his pretty currency he'd held too tightly. For too long, thousands of miles away, Jason sat in his flat, the phone pressed to his ear. One ring, two, then a voice older, familiar and cautious. Yeah, came the gruff voice of his brother Dean. Jason didn't speak for a moment. His throat tightened. He hadn't heard that voice in over a decade. It's me, Jason said, voice low. I saw something last night that reminded me. What I walked away from, silence. Then Dean said, took you long enough. Jason almost laughed. Instead, he exhaled something between a sigh and a prayer. I don't know what to say, Dean answered. Then don't say anything. Just show up. The line clicked dead. No goodbye. No confirmation. But that was Dean's way. Jason stared at the phone, jaw clenched, then allowed himself a single nod. It wasn't forgiveness, wasn't closure. But it was the door cracking open. And for two men raised in storms, sometimes the smallest opening is all the sunlight they need to step forward. 2 weeks later, photos surfaced on social media quiet, untagged, posted without fanfare. Steve Harvey and his son Brandon, seated on a bench in a public park, heads leaned together in conversation. No smiles, no posing. Just a father and son rediscovering a language they'd forgotten how to speak. Steve didn't mention it on his show. He didn't need to. The people who mattered saw it. They understood behind the scenes. He told his staff, don't make a segment out of it. Some healing don't need lights on it. Meanwhile in London, Jason made good on his word. He showed up at Dean's garage. The same garage they built their first bike in, back when they still believed life was simple. No cameras, no headlines. Just two men and a set of tools, working side by side again. No talking at first, just the sound of metal, grease, and shared history. Eventually, Dean spoke. "You still don't know how to tune a carburetor." Jason grinned. "You still don't know how to apologize." Dean looked up, eyes narrowed. Then he nodded slow, approving. That was all they needed. What Jason and Steve both came to understand in those weeks was something far greater than reconciliation. It was the quiet, sacred act of returning, of admitting where they'd failed, and showing up anyway. Not with grand speeches, not with scripted lines, just presence, just honesty. It wasn't about erasing the past. It was about facing it hand, choosing, in spite of everything, to keep loving. And somehow, that one message, recorded quietly, delivered unexpectedly, had become the bridge between two fractured pairs of brothers. Moments like this don't come. Often they're not manufactured, not rehearsed. They rise out of truth, delivered raw, without warning. And in this story, it's two men both icons in their own way let their armor fall just long enough to remind us of something eternal. It's never too late to turn back toward someone you love. Steve Harvey didn't plan to cry on television. Statham didn't plan to send a message that would ripple across continents. But life has a way of catching us off guard when we're finally quiet enough to listen. There are people watching this right now, some with unanswered calls, some with unopened letters, some who've rehearsed apologies in the mirror for years. If that's you, let this story remind you of something simple and true. It doesn't take perfection to heal a relationship, just courage and presence. Jason didn't need Steve to fix his past. He just needed someone to say, "You're not the only one." And Steve didn't need a stage to make peace. He just needed a moment of clarity. A voice from the shadows reminding him of the words he once gave freely. If there's someone you've lost, it's not through death, but distance. Don't wait for fate to hand you a microphone. Say what needs saying, not for applause, but for peace. And maybe, like Steve and Jason, you'll find that the bridge back is shorter than you thought. You just have to take that first step. We'll leave you with this. The hardest words to say are often the most important. Say them anyway.